221. That is how many times the deep edge of the Cascadia subduction zone slipped and hummed on Thursday night, and every single one of them happened in the wrong place. Early that same morning, the floor of the Pacific broke twice off the coast of Oregon, 80 miles out, in the dark, and nobody felt a thing. It was a magnitude 4.9, it made no news, and when I went looking for the response underneath the southern margin, where the disturbance should have registered, there was nothing there. The place that got disturbed stayed silent. The place that did not lit up. And the fault sitting in between them has now been quiet for 326 years. So what exactly did that little earthquake just show us? Before we go any further, if you enjoy what we do here at Project Nightwatch, hit like and subscribe so you don't miss any of our nightly debriefs. Also, drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from. Let's get into it. Part 1. 8 seconds apart. At 2:55 in the morning on Thursday the 6th of August 2026, the floor of the Pacific Ocean broke about 80 miles west-southwest of Port Orford, Oregon. The earthquake measured magnitude 4.9. Nobody felt it. No building shook. No alarm sounded. There was no tsunami warning, because there was nothing to warn about. Most of the people who live along that stretch of the Oregon coast were asleep, and the ones who were awake had no idea anything had happened at all. 8 seconds later, a second earthquake broke about 30 miles to the east of the first one, closer to shore, roughly 50 miles west of Gold Beach. That one measured magnitude 4.1 at a reported depth of about 5 miles, which out there is essentially the surface. 8 seconds, 30 miles. Two separate patches of seafloor, failing almost simultaneously, in the middle of the night, in a part of the ocean that almost nobody is watching. In coordinated universal time, the time zone that seismologists actually work in so that nobody has to argue about daylight saving, that first event is stamped at 9:55 in the morning. The catalogue entry is about as unglamorous as a catalogue entry gets. A magnitude, a latitude, a longitude, a depth that we're going to have some serious questions about later, and a location description that is basically a distance and a direction from the nearest town anybody has heard of. There is no damage report attached to it, because there was no damage. There is no felt report attached to it, because there was nobody out there to feel it. 2,500 feet of cold water, several hundred miles of open ocean, and a fishing fleet that would not have noticed a magnitude 6. Now, I want to be honest with you right at the top, because this story only works if we are honest about it. A magnitude 4.9 earthquake is not a big earthquake. If that same event had happened underneath a city, you would have had rattled windows, some car alarms, maybe a few cracked plaster walls, and a lot of people posting about it. Out there, 130 kilometers offshore, in water thousands of feet deep, it was less than nothing. It did not make the news. It did not make most local news. It appeared as a small dot on a map sitting in a patch of blue, and then it scrolled off the bottom of the page as the next day's earthquakes came in. And here is the part I want to give you now, at the beginning, instead of holding it back for an hour. That earthquake did not load the Cascadia subduction zone. It did not push the megathrust closer to failure. It did not transfer meaningful stress toward the coastline. We're going to walk through exactly why, with the actual physics and the actual numbers, because seismologists have already answered this precise question about this precise stretch of ocean, and their answer was unambiguous. I am not going to spend 2 hours building toward a reveal that a small quake is secretly a trigger. It is not. So why are we here? We are here because of what happened around that earthquake. 3 things, specifically, and each one of them is more interesting than the earthquake itself. The first thing is what happened onshore afterward. About 90 minutes after that magnitude 4.9, small earthquakes started registering to the east and southeast of it, in the direction of the coast, in the region where the Gorda Plate is being forced down underneath North America. One of them was a magnitude 1.4. Later that same day, after dark, a magnitude 2.0 registered at a depth of about 14 miles in the southern end of the Cascadia subduction zone. A magnitude 2.0 is a nothing earthquake. You would not feel it standing on top of it, but there is a fact about the Cascadia megathrust that makes even a nothing earthquake in that location worth writing down, and it comes straight out of a United States Geological Survey fact sheet published last year. Here is the sentence, word for word. Notably, there have been very few small to moderate magnitude earthquakes observed on the Cascadia megathrust. Think about what that sentence is actually saying. The fault that runs down the entire coastline of the Pacific Northwest, The fault that is capable of producing a magnitude 9, the fault that everyone in Oregon and Washington and Northern California has been told to prepare for, does not produce ordinary earthquakes. It does not grumble. It does not tick over. Almost every other major fault on Earth produces a steady background hum of small events, the way a machine under load makes noise. Cascadia does not. It is, seismologically speaking, almost completely silent. So when a small earthquake shows up at plate interface depth in the southern portion of that silent fault, on the same day that the ocean floor broke 130 kilometers offshore, it is not proof of anything. But it is not nothing either. It is an unusual number sitting in an unusual place. The second thing is what did not happen, and this is the one that I have not been able to stop thinking about since Thursday night. Underneath the Cascadia margin, deeper than the part of the fault that is locked and loaded, the plate boundary does something strange. It slips, not in earthquakes, in slow motion. Over days and weeks, a section of the fault deep below the coastline creeps forward by an amount that would normally take months to accumulate. And while it does that, it produces a faint, low-frequency seismic rumble that scientists call tectonic tremor. The combination has a name: episodic tremor and slip. It happens on a rough cycle, somewhere between every 8 and every 22 months, and no human being has ever felt one. That tremor is tracked publicly. Anybody can look at it. And on Thursday night, after the offshore earthquakes, the tremor map showed something that stopped me cold. There were roughly 221 tremor epicentres logged across the margin. Almost every single one of them was in the north, clustered densely underneath the Olympia, Washington area, about 700 kilometers away from where the earthquakes had happened. In the south, where the ocean floor had just broken, where the small onshore quakes had just registered, where the plate is being shoved down underneath Northern California and Southern Oregon, there was effectively nothing new. The place that got disturbed did not answer. The place that did not get disturbed lit up. Now, there are two ways to read that, and I am going to hold both of them for you through this entire video, because the difference between them is the difference between honest monitoring and scaring people for no reason. Reading one, the boring reading, the one the physics supports, is that the southern margin did not respond because there was nothing to respond to. The earthquakes were too small and too far away to matter, and the tremor in the north is part of a cycle that was already running and could not care less what the Gorda Ridge does. Reading 2 is that the deep portion of the interface beneath southern Cascadia is not currently letting go the way it usually does. Both readings fit what we can see. Only one of them is comfortable. And then there is the third thing, and the third thing was true before Thursday, and will still be true next month and next year, and it is the reason any of this is worth 2 hours of your evening. The last time the Cascadia subduction zone produced a great earthquake was the 26th of January 1700. We know the date to the day, and I'm going to show you how we know that, because it is one of the most remarkable pieces of detective work in the history of geology. That earthquake was somewhere between magnitude 8.7 and magnitude 9.2. That was 326 years ago. The United States Geological Survey's own working figure for how often the southern portion of Cascadia produces a magnitude 8 to 9 earthquake, counting both the full-length ruptures and the partial ones, is about 1 every 330 years, 326, against 330. And when you go into the geological record and count every interval between every Cascadia earthquake over the last 10,000 years, all 41 of them, only 8 of those intervals lasted longer than the one we're sitting in right now. Narrow that window to the last 6,000 years, and the current gap is longer than about 90% of them. Narrow it to the last 4,000 years, and it is longer than roughly 95% of them, 19 out of 20. That is where we are. And if you widen the definition slightly, to include every Cascadia rupture of magnitude 7.5 and above rather than just the great ones, the average interval between events across the whole record drops to about 233 years. Not 330, 233. By that accounting, we passed the average nearly a century ago and kept going. I want to be very careful with those numbers, because averages are the most abused statistic in this entire field. An average recurrence interval is not a due date. It is a description of how a fault has behaved over 10,000 years, and Cascadia's individual intervals range from under a century to more than 5 centuries. Nobody who works on this professionally will tell you the region is overdue, and the most Cascadia-focused public education project in the Pacific Northwest goes out of its way to say so in plain language on its own website. The region is inside the window, it could go tomorrow, it could go in 200 years. There is no schedule, there is no countdown, there is no prediction. And all of that is true at the same time as this. 326 years is longer than 19 out of every 20 intervals in the last 4,000 years of the geological record. So no, a magnitude 4.9 off the coast of Oregon is not a warning shot. There is no mechanism for it to be one. But it is the thing that made me open the tremor map on Thursday night. And when I did, the tremor map showed me a margin that has been holding its breath for 3 centuries and did not so much as twitch when the ocean floor cracked next door. Which raises a question that I genuinely do not have a good answer to, and neither, as far as I can tell, does anyone else. If the best instrumented, most thoroughly studied subduction zone on the entire planet can go 326 years without giving us a single clear signal, then what exactly is the warning supposed to look like when it comes, and would we know we were looking at it? Part 2. The place where the ocean floor is manufactured. To understand why nobody panicked about Thursday's earthquakes, and to understand why they are still worth talking about, you have to understand where they happened. And where they happened is one of the strangest pieces of real estate on the surface of this planet, even though you will never see it, because it is under 2 miles of cold Pacific water. About 200 miles off the coast of southern Oregon, there is a seam in the seafloor called the Gorda Ridge. It is a spreading center. That means it is one of the places on Earth where new crust is being manufactured. Molten rock rises from the mantle, reaches the seafloor, cools, and becomes new ocean floor, and then that new floor is pushed outward in both directions to make room for the next batch. The planet has been running this process continuously for billions of years. Every square inch of ocean floor you have ever swum over was made at a ridge like this one and then shoved sideways. The rock coming out of a spreading center is, geologically speaking, brand new. It is warm, it is fractured. It has not had time to become the hard, brittle, well-organized material that older crust becomes. Hold on to that detail because in about 10 minutes, it is going to explain something important. Running northwest away from the Gorda Ridge is a second structure called the Blanco Fracture Zone. This is not a spreading center, this is a transform fault, which means the 2 sides slide horizontally past each other rather than pulling apart or crashing together. The San Andreas Fault is a transform fault. The Blanco is the same basic idea, except it is out in the open ocean, roughly 350 kilometers long, somewhere between 20 and 75 kilometers wide, and it connects the Gorda Ridge in the south to the Juan de Fuca Ridge in the north. And then east of both of those, being pushed toward the coastline, is the Gorda Plate. The Gorda Plate is small. It is also, by a wide margin, one of the most internally beaten-up pieces of tectonic plate anywhere on Earth. Picture a piece of crust with the Pacific Plate grinding along its southern edge, the Juan de Fuca system on its northern edge, and the North American continent standing in front of it, refusing to move. It is being squeezed from 3 directions at once. Most tectonic plates behave like rigid slabs, and most of the interesting action happens at their edges. The Gorda does not have that luxury. It deforms internally, it cracks in the middle, it produces earthquakes in places where a well-behaved plate simply would not. Put those 3 things together, and what you have off the coast of southern Oregon and far northern California is a region where crust is being created, sheared sideways, and crushed, all within a couple of 100 miles of each other. It is one of the most seismically busy patches of ocean in the northern hemisphere. So when I tell you that a magnitude 4.9 went off out there on Thursday morning, the correct reaction from a seismologist's point of view is a shrug. That region produces magnitude 4 events routinely. It produces magnitude 5 events regularly. It has produced magnitude 6.3 and magnitude 7 earthquakes within living memory. In fact, the Geological Survey's own summary of the area notes that the Gorda Plate region experiences a few offshore earthquakes of magnitude 6.5 or greater every decade, within about 100 miles of the coastline, and that many of those are felt on land. That is not a theoretical claim. The list of large earthquakes from that stretch of ocean, and the coastline next to it is long, and it is recent. In 1980, a magnitude 7.2 struck offshore of Eureka, California. In 1992, the Petrolia sequence produced another magnitude 7.2, and that one did real damage on land. In 2010, a magnitude 6.5 hit off Eureka again. In 2022, the Ferndale earthquake, magnitude 6.4, cracked roads and knocked out power for tens of thousands of people. and in December of 2024, a magnitude 7.0 went off offshore of Cape Mendocino and triggered a tsunami warning that briefly emptied buildings up and down the Northern California coast before it was cancelled. Every one of those was larger than Thursday's earthquake. Several of them were more than 1,000 times larger in terms of energy released, and not one of them started a Cascadia rupture, which brings up a fair question. If magnitude 6.5 events happen out there every few years, why are we spending any time at all on a 4.9? Two reasons, and the first one is the 8 seconds. The second earthquake on Thursday morning did not follow the first one after a decent interval, the way an aftershock normally does. It followed it after 8 seconds, at a distance of about 30 miles. 8 seconds is roughly how long it takes a seismic wave to travel 30 miles through oceanic crust. That timing is not a coincidence in the casual sense. It is either two pieces of one structure failing as a single connected event, or it is what seismologists call dynamic triggering, where the shaking from one earthquake physically nudges a second patch of fault that was already sitting right at the edge of failure. We will come back to that, because dynamic triggering at that range from an earthquake that's small is genuinely unusual. It is normally something we talk about after magnitude 8 events, not magnitude 4 events. The second reason is more mundane and in its own way more troubling. We have almost no idea how many earthquakes actually happen out there. Here is the problem. The instruments that detect and locate those earthquakes are seismometers, and seismometers have to sit on land. The nearest ones to the Gorda Ridge are on the Oregon and California coast, hundreds of kilometers to the east. Seismic energy spreads out and weakens as it travels. By the time the shaking from a small offshore earthquake reaches the nearest station, it has faded below the level of background noise, the constant low-level hum of the planet, the ocean, the wind, and human activity. It does not get detected. It does not get located. It does not go into the catalogue. It effectively did not happen, as far as the record is concerned. The Pacific Northwest Seismic Network has been admirably blunt about the second half of this problem, which is depth. When you look up one of these offshore earthquakes and see a depth of 10 kilometers listed, that number is very often not a measurement. Here is how they put it, word for word. Constraining depths with data from stations far away and for shallow events is very difficult, so 10 kilometers is just a default number given for shallow events with source station geometries like we have here. 10 kilometers, in other words, frequently means we do not know. It means shallow. It is a placeholder that has been quietly doing a lot of work in a lot of maps, so think about what that means for our story. On Thursday morning, 2 earthquakes were detected out there. How many actually occurred? 10, 50, 100. There is genuinely no way to know from land, and there is nothing sinister about that. It is a physics problem, and the physics does not care how curious we are. There is a way to fix this, by the way, and it is not theoretical. You put the instruments on the seafloor. Cabled ocean observatories with seismometers and pressure sensors sitting directly on the plate boundary, running fibre back to shore, would transform what we know about the offshore portion of this system. Some of that infrastructure exists off the coast of British Columbia and Oregon already, and every additional node is a piece of the fault that stops being invisible. It is expensive. It is also the only way anyone is ever going to see what the locked zone is doing, because the locked zone is offshore, and every land-based instrument in the Pacific Northwest is looking at it from behind. That is the setting. A brand new, badly beaten up, 3-way junction of a seafloor monitored from 300 kilometers away by instruments that can only hear the loud parts. And 130 kilometers to the east of it, sitting quietly under the continental shelf, is the fault that everyone is actually worried about, which is where the next question comes in, and it is the one that most people jumped to on Thursday, including a lot of people who should know better. Did the ocean floor breaking push that fault any closer to breaking too? The answer is no. And the way we know it is no is one of the most useful pieces of public science communication I have ever read. Part 3. The cookie fresh out of the oven. In December of 2021, something happened on the Blanco fracture zone that made Thursday's little pair of earthquakes look like a rounding error. Over the course of about 3 days, 88 earthquakes went off along the western end of the Blanco. 15 of them were magnitude 5.0 or larger. The 2 biggest were magnitude 5.8. At one point on the Tuesday, there were roughly 40 earthquakes in a 4-hour window. If that had happened underneath a populated area, you would have had cracked streets, broken foundations, and a very long night. And so, Entirely predictably, people started asking the obvious question, is this going to set off Cascadia? The Pacific Northwest Seismic Network, which is the organization that actually runs the seismometers across Washington and Oregon, sat down and wrote a public explanation. And it is worth going through carefully because it answers Thursday's question completely, and it does it with more rigor than any of us are going to manage on our own. They started with energy. The magnitude scale is logarithmic, which is a word that hides how violent the arithmetic is. Every whole step up the scale is roughly a 32-fold increase in the energy released. So a magnitude 5 releases about 32 times the energy of a magnitude 4. A magnitude 6 releases about 1,000 times the energy of a magnitude 4, and so on. The consequence is that big earthquakes do not just dominate the energy budget. They are the energy budget. Everything else is noise. So they added it up. All 88 of those earthquakes, including the 15 5s and the 2 5.8s, combined, released about as much energy as a single magnitude 6.3. One earthquake's worth. 88 events, 3 days of continuous rupture, and the whole thing was equivalent to one moderate quake. And then they made the comparison that matters. There had already been an actual magnitude 6.3 out there in the summer of 2019, and after that one, there was no increase in activity on the Cascadia subduction zone. None. The margin did not notice. Here is their conclusion, in their own words. The slip on these earthquakes are unlikely to have caused significant changes in stress along the Cascadia subduction zone 200 kilometers closer to shore, and then they went further, which I appreciate because it closes off the obvious follow-up question. Even a magnitude 7.0, which on that segment would mean a rupture around 20 miles long, would be unlikely to significantly load the subduction zone. Let me put Thursday's earthquake against that. A magnitude 4.9 releases roughly 1/1000th of the energy of a magnitude 7. So the network is telling us that an event 1,000 times larger than Thursday's would probably still not matter. That is not a close call. That is not a judgment call. That is 3 orders of magnitude of margin. But the reasoning underneath the conclusion is the part I actually want you to take away, because it applies to every earthquake story you will ever hear, and it is the single most misunderstood idea in this entire subject. Reason 1 is distance. When a fault ruptures, it changes the stress in the rock around it. That change is real, it is measurable, and it is how one earthquake can encourage another one nearby. But that effect decays with distance, and it decays fast. As a rule of thumb, static stress changes reach out on the order of a few rupture lengths from the source, not a few hundred miles, a few times the length of the crack itself. So how long was Thursday's crack? A magnitude 4.9 ruptures, something on the order of 1 to 2 kilometers of fault. Call it a mile. And it is worth being concrete about what that actually means physically, because magnitude numbers hide the scale. A magnitude 4.9 is not a fault tearing open across a landscape. It is a patch of rock roughly a mile across, buried under a couple of miles of seafloor and 2 miles of water, sliding past the rock next to it by something on the order of a few centimeters. A hand's width of movement, over an area smaller than a lot of towns, releasing its energy in about a second. Now compare that to what a magnitude 9 looks like. A rupture running the better part of 1,000 kilometers from Northern California to Vancouver Island, 100 kilometers wide, with slip of 10 to 20 meters, shaking for 4 to 6 minutes. The difference is not a difference of degree. It is a difference of category. They are barely the same phenomenon. And how far away is the locked portion of the southern Cascadia megathrust? About 200 kilometers. That is roughly 100 rupture lengths away. It is not in the neighborhood. It is not on the same continent as the neighborhood. Reason 2 is the material, and this is where that detail about new crust comes back. The seafloor out at the Gorda Ridge is young. It was manufactured recently, geologically speaking, and it is warm and fractured and, for want of a better word, soft. Old crust is brittle. Brittle material transmits stress. It holds a load and passes it along. Young, warm, fractured crust absorbs the load instead, deforming in 1,000 small ways rather than passing the force through. The network's analogy for this is the best one I have heard in years, and I'm going to steal it wholesale. Applying stress to young crust is like applying stress to a gooey cookie fresh out of the oven. It just breaks into a lot of small pieces. Applying stress to old brittle crust is like applying it to a week-old cookie. That one snaps clean in half and passes the force right through. So Cascadia is sitting 200 kilometers away, on the far side of a lot of gooey cookie, from an earthquake that cracked about a mile of sea floor. They also offered a second analogy for the distance problem that I have not been able to improve on. Imagine a baby screeching directly next to you at the dinner table. In seismological terms, you're in the near field. It is extremely stressful, and there are significant changes in stress, and their words there, not mine, come with a small joke attached. But if you are a few houses down the street in the far field, the only way you would ever know it happened is if somebody sent you a recording. And a recording of a screaming baby is a very different experience from the baby. Cascadia is a few houses down the street, and then there is the tsunami question, which is worth 30 seconds because it comes up every single time. Tsunamis require vertical motion. You have to lift or drop a large area of seafloor to displace the water column above it. The Blanco fracture zone is a transform boundary, like the San Andreas. The two sides slide past each other horizontally. Horizontal motion does not displace water vertically, which is why an earthquake out there, even a large one, does not generate a Pacific-wide tsunami. That is also, incidentally, why the coastline did not get a warning on Thursday. There was nothing to warn about. The system worked exactly as designed by not doing anything. So there it is. The mechanism does not exist. The distance is wrong by 2 orders of magnitude. The material in between absorbs rather than transmits, and a swarm 100 times bigger than Thursday's, in the same place, produced no response from Cascadia at all. And then, a week later, they went back and updated the post, which is a thing that almost nobody does and everybody should. In the 6 days after they published, there had been 4 more earthquakes on the Blanco, magnitudes 4.1 to 4.5, and, in their words, not surprisingly, no change in activity on the subduction zone. That is a scientist publicly checking their own homework in public, in near real time, with a testable prediction attached. I would like considerably more of that in the world. If you came into this video wanting me to tell you that a magnitude 4.9 started a countdown, I cannot do it, and anyone who does is selling you something. But here is what I keep coming back to. That entire explanation is about what the earthquake did to Cascadia. It is not about what the earthquake showed us about Cascadia. Those are completely different questions, and the second one has a much stranger answer, because roughly 90 minutes after that magnitude 4.9, the ground started moving on the other side of the gap. Part 4. 90 minutes later, something moved onshore. At around 4:30 in the morning Pacific time, an hour and a half after the ocean floor broke, a magnitude 1.4 registered inland and to the southeast of the offshore epicentres, in the direction of the coastline, in the direction of the place where the Gorda Plate slides underneath North America. A magnitude 1.4 is, and I want to be precise about this, an absolutely trivial earthquake. It is smaller than a truck going over a pothole outside your house. It is detected by instruments and by nothing else. On a normal day, there are dozens of them across California, and nobody writes any of them down except a computer. Later that same day, there were more. A magnitude 1.2, a magnitude 1.8, at least one entry near Medford that the catalogue flagged not as an earthquake at all but as an explosion, which is a routine and important distinction, because quarry blasts and mine shots show up on seismometers constantly, and a good catalogue separates them out. A magnitude 2.1 near Crescent City, California, and then, late Thursday night, the one that made me sit forward, a magnitude 2.0 at a depth of approximately 14 miles in the southern end of the Cascadia subduction zone. Now, if you have been paying attention, you already know that I am about to talk myself out of my own excitement, and you are right, and we are going to do it properly. But first let me explain why that particular dot on that particular map is not like the others. 14 miles is about 22 kilometres. That is deeper than the crustal faults of the coast ranges, which mostly operate in the top 10 or 12 kilometres. It is not deep enough to be one of the very deep intraslab earthquakes that happen inside the descending plate itself, the kind that produced the 1949 Olympia quake, the 1965 Seattle quake, and the 2001 Nisqually quake in Washington. 22 kilometres, at that position along the margin, puts you at, or very near, the plate interface, the megathrust, the thing itself. And here is the fact I read you at the top of this video, which I want to read you again now that it has somewhere to land. From the Geological Survey's 2025 assessment of earthquake probabilities and hazards in the Pacific Northwest. Notably, there have been very few small to moderate magnitude earthquakes observed on the Cascadia megathrust. Sit with how unusual that is. Take the San Andreas. It produces small earthquakes constantly. Take the Hayward Fault, or the Calaveras, or the Macama up in Mendocino County. They tick over, they creep, they produce magnitude 1s and 2s and 3s at a steady rate, and seismologists use that background rate to estimate how the fault is behaving. Take almost any subduction zone on the Ring of Fire. Japan's plate boundaries produce a continuous stream of small interface events. Chile's do, the Aleutians do, the Kurile Arc does. Small earthquakes are how a loaded fault talks. Cascadia does not talk. The plate interface off the coast of Oregon and Washington and Northern California is, over the entire instrumental record, almost silent. There is essentially no ordinary background seismicity on the fault that is going to produce a magnitude 9. Nobody is entirely sure why. The leading explanation is that the interface is so completely locked over such a large area that there simply are no small patches free to slip independently. The whole thing is stuck as a unit, accumulating strain, with nothing releasing it in pieces, which, if it is correct, is not a comforting explanation. A fault that produces a steady stream of small earthquakes is a fault that is bleeding off strain in survivable increments. A fault that produces nothing at all is a fault that is saving it. So a magnitude 2.0 at plate interface depth on the same day as offshore rupture is a small number in a location where small numbers are rare. Now here is the part where I talk myself down, because this is the discipline that separates monitoring from fear. The word rare is doing a lot of work in that sentence, and rare does not mean unprecedented. There are small events in that depth range in the catalogue. Some of them are genuinely on the interface. Some are in the overlying crust and have been assigned a depth with more uncertainty than the 2 decimal places imply, and some are inside the descending slab. Depth solutions in that region are not precise. This event has not been the subject of a published moment tensor analysis, which is the tool you would actually need to say what kind of fault motion produced it. Without that, calling it a megathrust earthquake is an assumption dressed up as an observation. And then there is the timing question, which is the one everybody wants answered. Did the offshore earthquake cause it? 3 possibilities, and I will rank them honestly. The first is coincidence, and it is the front runner by a wide margin. Both of these regions produce small earthquakes every day. When you watch 2 independent processes at the same time, you will constantly see things that look like sequences. 90 minutes is not a meaningful interval. It is what randomness looks like when you're staring at it and hoping. The second is dynamic triggering. When seismic waves from an earthquake travel through the crust, they briefly stress every fault they pass through. If a fault is already sitting at the absolute knife edge of failure, that momentary stress can be the last straw. This is a real, documented phenomenon. It has been observed at distances of thousands of kilometers, but it is overwhelmingly associated with very large earthquakes, magnitude 8 and above, and the triggered events are typically very small. If dynamic triggering happened on Thursday, then the magnitude 1.4 and the magnitude 2.0 are the entire effect, and no strain of any consequence moved anywhere. The third possibility is the interesting one and the hardest one to test. Not that the offshore earthquake caused the onshore events, but that both of them are expressions of the same thing. The Gorda plate is being squeezed from 3 sides. If that squeezing intensifies, even slightly, you would expect it to show up on multiple structures at once, offshore and onshore, without either one causing the other. That is a shared driver rather than a chain reaction, and on a 24-hour timescale there is no way to distinguish it from coincidence. You would need months of data. Let me lay the whole day out in order, because when you see it as a timeline rather than as a list of magnitudes, you understand both why it caught people's attention and why it does not actually prove anything. 2:55 in the morning. The magnitude 4.9 breaks about 80 miles west-southwest of Port Orford. 2:55 and 8 seconds. The magnitude 4.1 breaks 30 miles east of it. Roughly 4:30 in the morning, the magnitude 1.4 registers to the southeast, inland of both, toward the margin. Through the morning and afternoon, a scattering of very small events across southern Oregon and far northern California. A 1.2, a 1.8, the catalogued explosion near Medford, the magnitude 2.1 near Crescent City. Late evening, the magnitude 2.0 at 14 miles depth in the southern subduction zone. Read that top to bottom and it looks like a sequence. It looks like something starting offshore and working its way inland toward the coast over the course of a day. That is a compelling shape, and the human brain is exceptionally good at finding it. Now read it a different way. On any given Thursday, Northern California and southern Oregon produce a scattering of magnitude 1 and magnitude 2 earthquakes. The region has coast range faults, geothermal fields, quarries, the Mendocino Triple Junction, the Gorda Plate's internal deformation, and the subduction zone itself, all producing small events at various rates. If you take any random day, remove the offshore quake, and lay out the remaining small events in chronological order, you will get a list that looks broadly like the one I just read you, and nobody would look at it twice. The sequence is only a sequence because we put an earthquake at the top of it. That is not me dismissing it. It is me being honest about what the shape of a list can and cannot tell you. If over the next fortnight small events continue to migrate eastward toward the margin and get progressively larger, that changes the assessment completely. One day of small numbers does not. So what do we actually have? We have a handful of tiny earthquakes in an unusual location in the same day as offshore rupture, with 3 possible explanations, of which the boring one is most likely. Which is exactly why the next thing matters so much. Because there was one measurement that could have told us something real. One system that would actually respond if the deep part of the margin had been disturbed, and I went and looked at it on Thursday night, fully expecting to find it lit up. Part 5. The sound the fault makes when it is slipping. In 2003, a paper appeared in the journal Science with one of the better titles in the history of geophysics, Episodic Tremor and Slip on the Cascadia Subduction Zone, the chatter of silent slip. The chatter of silent slip. That is the whole phenomenon in 4 words. Here is what had been found. Underneath the Pacific Northwest, deeper than the locked portion of the megathrust, the plate boundary was doing something that nobody had a category for. Global positioning stations planted in the ground across Washington and British Columbia, which spend their lives measuring how the continent is being squashed eastward by the descending plate, would occasionally show something impossible. For a week or two, individual stations would reverse direction. The ground would move back the way it came, not violently. Nobody felt anything, but measurably. And then, after a week or two, everything would go back to normal and resume creeping east. At the same time, the seismometers were recording something equally strange. Not earthquakes. Earthquakes are sharp. They arrive as a crack and decay away, and a trained eye can pick the arrival of the compressional wave and the shear wave and calculate a location from them. What was showing up instead was a low-frequency hum. It went on for hours or days. It had no clear beginning. It looked, on a seismogram, less like a gunshot and more like someone dragging a heavy table across a floor upstairs. And the two things happened together. Every time the ground reversed direction, the hum was there. Every time the hum appeared, the ground was reversing. That is episodic tremor and slip. What is physically happening is this. The part of the plate boundary that everybody worries about, the locked zone, sits relatively shallow and relatively close to the coast offshore. That section is stuck fast. It is not moving at all, which is precisely the problem, because the plate behind it is still being driven forward, and everything that does not move is strain being stored in the rock. Go deeper down the same fault surface and conditions change. It gets hotter. Fluids come out of the descending plate through metamorphic reactions, and those fluids get squeezed up into the fault zone where they raise the pressure and effectively lubricate the boundary. At those depths and pressures, the rock cannot store strain the way brittle rock does. So it fails differently. Instead of sticking and then snapping, it slides slowly, over days and weeks, and the sliding grinds out that low-frequency chatter as it goes. In Cascadia, these episodes happen on a rough cycle, somewhere between every 8 months and every 22 months, and the interval varies systematically along the margin. In some sections, it is close to 14 months. In others, it is closer to 11. During a single episode, a stretch of the deep interface can slip by an amount that would normally take several months to accumulate, and the whole thing migrates along strike at something like 5 to 15 kilometers a day, which means you can watch it travel down the coastline over the course of a few weeks. You have never felt one. You never will. The energy is spread over so long a time that it never builds into shaking. But the total amount of movement in a big episode is equivalent to a magnitude 6 or magnitude 7 earthquake, released over a fortnight instead of a minute. It is worth walking through where those fluids actually come from, because it is the step that most explanations skip, and it is the step that makes the whole thing make sense. When oceanic crust is manufactured at a spreading ridge, seawater gets into it. It circulates through cracks, reacts with the hot rock, and chemically bonds into the minerals themselves. That water is not sitting in pores, it is built into the crystal structure. Then that crust spends a few million years travelling east, and eventually it gets shoved down underneath a continent, and as it goes down it gets hotter, and it gets squeezed. At certain depths and temperatures the minerals holding that water become unstable. They break down, and the water that has been locked in the rock since the day it was made comes back out, all at once, as a free fluid, at enormous pressure, several tens of kilometres underground. That fluid has nowhere to go but up, and up means into the fault surface. High-pressure fluid in a fault zone reduces the effective clamping force, holding the two sides together. It does not lubricate in the sense of making things slippery. It does something better, or worse, depending on your point of view. It reduces the weight pressing the fault shut. So the deep interface is a fault surface being continuously injected with high-pressure water released by a chemical reaction. That is why it slides instead of snapping. And it is also, incidentally, why it hums, because the tremor signal appears to come from swarms of tiny slip events on that fluid-saturated boundary, each one far too small to be an earthquake, all of them together producing a continuous rumble. The migration is the other detail worth knowing, because it is what turns tremor from a number into a picture. An episode does not switch on across the whole margin at once. It starts somewhere, and it propagates a long strike at a rate of roughly 5 to 15 kilometres a day, and it can also jump backwards in bursts that travel far faster. Watch the map for a fortnight during an episode, and you will see a front move down the coastline. It is one of the very few tectonic processes on Earth slow enough to watch and fast enough to finish. And here is the part that makes tremor genuinely important rather than merely fascinating. The deep zone that is slipping sits directly underneath and directly connected to the locked zone that is not slipping. When the deep section slides forward, it drags on the bottom edge of the locked patch. It transfers stress upward into it. So every tremor episode is, in a small way, a loading event for the part of the fault that is going to produce the earthquake, which is why people watch it. It is the closest thing Cascadia has to a gauge. The megathrust itself will not tell you anything. It produces essentially no earthquakes. But the deep section underneath it announces itself several times a decade, and every announcement is another turn of the ratchet. Now, having sold you on why it matters, I have to be extremely careful about what it does not do. Because this is where a lot of coverage goes badly wrong, including, in fairness, coverage I have watched and enjoyed. Tremor is not a countdown clock. The temptation is enormous. It is a signal that comes from the fault. It is connected to the loading process. It can be tracked in near real time, and it goes up and down. Every instinct says that if you watched it closely enough, it would tell you when. There is a real basis for the hope. Slow slip events have been observed to precede large megathrust earthquakes elsewhere. Before the 2011 Tohoku earthquake in Japan, there was slow slip migrating along the interface. Before the 2014 Iquique earthquake in Chile, there was slow slip. Those are documented, published, and not in dispute. But here is the sentence from the Geological Survey's 2025 assessment, and it is written with the kind of precision that tells you the authors argued about every word. Because episodic tremor and slip in Cascadia occurs on the subduction interface downdip of the locked zone, it is of scientific and practical interest to understand the relationship between it and large megathrust events. Slow slip events have been observed to precede megathrust earthquakes in Japan and Chile, but no known link exists between episodic tremor and slip and megathrust earthquake hazard in Cascadia. No known link, for this margin, right now. That does not mean there is no link. It means we have not found one, and we have had global positioning data and dense tremor catalogues for a little over 2 decades, and Cascadia has not produced a megathrust earthquake in that window, so we have precisely 0 examples of what the run-up looks like here. We are trying to learn the warning signs of an event that has not happened during the entire history of the instrument. So the correct way to hold tremor is this. It is a strain gauge, not a clock. It tells you the machine is running. It tells you the ratchet turned again. It does not tell you when the spring breaks. And with all of that established, here is what I actually went looking for on Thursday night. If the events offshore had disturbed the southern margin in any way, however slightly, one plausible place for it to show up would be in the deep zone underneath southern Oregon and northern California, as an uptick in tremor. So I pulled the map. Part 6. 221 points of light, all in the wrong place. The tremor map is public. Anyone can look at it. It is one of the genuinely great pieces of open scientific infrastructure in this country, and almost nobody outside the field knows it exists. You select a time window, and it draws every tremor epicenter detected in that window as a dot on a map of the Pacific Northwest, and the shape those dots make traces out the deep portion of the subduction zone with a clarity that is honestly beautiful. If you set it to show a whole year, you do not get a scatter, you get a ribbon, a long curved band running from Northern California up through Oregon and Washington and into British Columbia, hundreds of kilometers long and a few tens of kilometers wide. That ribbon is the deep edge of the Cascadia megathrust, drawn by the fault itself, one small slip at a time. On Thursday evening, the map showed roughly 221 tremor epicenters. They were almost all in the north. There was a dense concentration underneath the Olympia, Washington area, in the southern Puget Sound region. A real, active, obvious cluster. The kind of thing you look at and immediately know that a section of the deep interface is currently sliding. And in the south, in the stretch of margin underneath southern Oregon and northern California, in the exact region where the ocean floor had broken 16 hours earlier, and where the small onshore earthquakes had registered, there was effectively nothing new. I want to be careful with the word nothing, because tremor is not a binary. There was some background activity in the southern portion in the preceding days. The point is not that the south was at zero. The point is that it did not go up. There was no response. The offshore events came and went, and the deep interface beneath the southern margin carried on exactly as it had been, while 700 kilometers to the north, an unrelated episode was in full swing. So what does that mean? Reading number 1, and I will say again that this is the reading the physics supports and the one I would bet on, is that it means nothing at all, and its meaning nothing is precisely the point. We spent the whole of part 3 establishing that a magnitude 4.9 cannot meaningfully load a fault 200 kilometers away through young oceanic crust. If that is true, then the correct prediction is exactly what we observed. No response, because there was no stimulus. The tremor map on Thursday night is a successful test of the mainstream position. The theory said nothing would happen, and nothing happened, and I should be pleased about that rather than unsettled by it. The cluster in the north is not mysterious either. Episodic tremor and slip episodes migrate. They start somewhere along the margin and travel. Puget Sound has one of the best studied and most regular tremor cycles anywhere on Earth. A dense cluster underneath Olympia is a Thursday. Reading number 2 is the uncomfortable one, and it does not require anything supernatural, just a different weighting of the same facts. Every part of a subduction zone has to account for its motion somehow. The plate is being driven forward at roughly 3 to 4 centimeters a year, and every centimeter has to go somewhere. In the deep zone, it goes into slow slip and tremor. In the locked zone, it goes into stored strain. Those are the only two options, and the boundary between them, the transition zone, moves around a little depending on temperature, fluid pressure, and the properties of the rock. Now suppose, hypothetically, that the deep zone underneath the southern margin is currently less able to slip than it usually is. Suppose the transition has migrated downward, or the fluid pressure has dropped, or the interface there has become more strongly coupled than it was. What would you see? You would see less tremor in the south. You would see the accumulated motion going into strain instead of into slip. And you would see it while the northern margin, which is a different segment with different properties, carried on with its usual cycle. That is a hypothesis, not a finding. I have no way to test it from a public map, and neither does anybody else without a lot more data than one night's snapshot. But it is a coherent hypothesis, and it fits what was on the screen, and it is worth writing down. There is a version of this idea that has actually been published, and it is worth knowing about because it stops the hypothesis sounding like something I invented on a Thursday night. Researchers have proposed that the transition zone between the locked patch and the slipping patch is not a fixed line. It moves. Its position depends on temperature, on fluid pressure, and on the mineralogy of the rock at that depth, and all three of those can vary along the margin and over time. If the transition migrates downward in a particular segment, the locked zone gets bigger. A bigger locked zone means more area storing strain, and it also means a larger potential rupture area, which means a larger potential earthquake. Nobody has demonstrated that happening in southern Cascadia. But the mechanism is real, it is in the literature, and it is exactly the sort of thing that would show up first as a change in where and how much the deep zone slips, which is why the tremor record is worth building, even if we cannot yet read it. We are 20-odd years into a catalogue of a process that operates on a 300-year cycle. We are on Chapter 1. There is also a third thing on that map, at the far northern end, that has been bothering me for a while, and that I have talked about before, in the video from the middle of July about the magnitude 5.6 off Vancouver Island. Look at the very top of the tremor ribbon, and you will find a gap, a stretch of the margin at the northern terminus that produces essentially no slow slip at all. The interpretation that fits best is that the small plate up there, the Explorer plate, has effectively stopped subducting. It appears to be tearing away from the rest of the descending system, breaking off, going its own way. If a slab is not being shoved down underneath the continent, then there is no deep interface to slip, and no tremor to record. The absence on the map is not a gap in the data. It is a structural fact about the plate boundary, written in silence, which is a genuinely useful thing to know before we move on, because it establishes something important. Absence on a tremor map can mean something. It is not automatically noise. At the northern end, the absence is telling us that a piece of the machine has come apart. So when the southern end goes quiet after being disturbed, I do not think it is unreasonable to at least ask the question. There is a practical caveat here that I have to give you, and it cuts against my own argument, which is exactly why I am giving it to you. Tremor is not detected the way earthquakes are detected. An earthquake has a sharp arrival that a single station can pick and an analyst can time. Tremor has no sharp arrival at all. It is a smear. So the detection method is completely different. You take the seismic records from many stations at once, strip out the high frequencies, smooth what is left into an envelope of energy over time, and then look for the same wobble in that envelope showing up at multiple stations, with the time offsets you would expect if it came from a particular point underground. Do that continuously, and you can locate a source that no single instrument could ever pick out on its own. Which means tremor detection depends heavily on how many stations you have and how close together they are. The network is denser in Washington than it is in far northern California. It is denser near population centers than it is in the mountains of the Klamath and the Trinity Alps. So a quiet southern margin on a given night is partly a statement about the southern margin and partly a statement about how many instruments are listening to it. I do not think that explains what I saw on Thursday, because the southern margin has produced large, obvious tremor episodes on that same network before, including one just a couple of weeks ago that was concentrated in exactly that southern stretch. The instruments can clearly see it when it happens, but the caveat is real, and I am not going to pretend otherwise, but here is where I have to be straight with you about the limits of what any of this can support, and it is the same limit we hit in the last part. There is no known link between tremor and megathrust hazard in Cascadia, not more tremor and not less tremor. If you had seen the southern margin light up with 400 epicentres on Thursday night, I would have had to tell you the same thing I am telling you now. It would not have been a countdown either. The honest position is that we are watching a gauge whose calibration we do not have, on a machine that has not failed since before the United States existed. And that brings us to the number that has been sitting underneath this entire story from the first sentence. Because whatever the tremor map does or does not mean, whatever the offshore earthquakes did or did not do, there is one measurement about the Cascadia subduction zone that is not ambiguous, not contested, and not going to be improved by better instruments. 326 years. Part 7, January 26th, 1700. There is something faintly absurd about the fact that we know the date, not the century, not the decade, the date, the 26th of January in the year 1700. An earthquake that happened on a coastline with no written records, no instruments, no observers who left anything behind in a language European science could read, and we can put it on a calendar. The way that was worked out is, to my mind, one of the best detective stories in the history of science, and it took the better part of 2 decades and 4 completely independent lines of evidence that had no business agreeing with each other. The first line of evidence is the trees. If you walk certain stretches of the Washington and Oregon coast, you will come across stands of dead cedar standing in tidal marsh. Grey, bare, salt-killed, roots in water that no cedar should ever be growing in. Local people have known about them for generations. They are called ghost forests, and the question they pose is simple. How does a forest end up below sea level? The answer is that the ground dropped. When the Cascadia megathrust ruptures, the coastline does not just shake. The overriding plate, which has been bulged upward for centuries by the stuck fault beneath it, springs seaward and downward when it lets go. Whole sections of coast subside by 1 or 2 meters in the space of a few minutes. Forest that was above the tide line at breakfast is in the intertidal zone by lunchtime, and salt water kills the trees within a season or two. Now, here is the part that turns a story into a date. Trees keep records. Every year, a tree lays down a growth ring, and the width of that ring depends on the weather that year. Wet years give wide rings, dry years give narrow ones, and the resulting pattern of wide and narrow is essentially a barcode that is the same for every tree in a region. Take a living tree, read its rings back a few centuries, and then take a dead tree and match the overlapping section of pattern, and you can date the dead tree's rings exactly. Not approximately. Exactly. Do that for the ghost forests, and you find that the outermost complete ring is the one grown in 1699. The trees died between the end of the 1699 growing season and the start of the 1701. They died in the winter of 1699 to 1700. That narrows it to a season. The second line of evidence is the mud. Along the same estuaries, if you cut a trench into the marsh and look at the layers, you find something that should not be there. A buried soil with the remains of land plants in it, sitting underneath a layer of tidal mud, sometimes with a sheet of clean marine sand in between. That sequence is a recording of a single afternoon. The soil is the land surface before the earthquake. The sand is the tsunami coming in over the top of it. The mud is the years afterward, when that same surface, now a metre or 2 lower, was being covered by ordinary tides. Cut trenches up and down the margin, and you find that same sandwich again and again, at the same depth, from the same event. The third line of evidence is offshore, and it comes from a rather unexpected place. When the seafloor shakes violently, the loose sediment piled on the continental slope loses its footing and slides. It flows downhill as a dense underwater avalanche, travels along submarine canyons, spreads out on the abyssal plain, and settles. Coarse grains first, fine grains last. That deposit is called a turbidite, and it has a distinctive structure that is unmistakable in a sediment core. Now do that in dozens of separate canyons up and down the margin, canyons that have no connection to each other and no shared sediment source. If a turbidite appears in one canyon, something local happened. If the same turbidite appears simultaneously in canyons hundreds of kilometers apart, then whatever shook the sediment loose shook all of them at once, and the only thing that does that is a very large earthquake. Chris Goldfinger and his colleagues at Oregon State spent decades building that record out of sediment cores, and it is the reason we can talk about 10,000 years of Cascadia earthquakes rather than 300. The fourth line is the one that supplies the day, and it comes from the other side of the ocean. In January of 1700, a tsunami came ashore in Japan. It flooded villages along several hundred kilometers of coastline. It damaged rice paddies, wrecked buildings, and was written up in local records, because Japanese communities in that era kept careful written accounts of exactly this kind of thing, complete with dates. And there was no earthquake. Japanese tsunamis come after Japanese earthquakes. That is the pattern, and it had been the pattern for as long as anyone had been writing things down. This wave arrived on its own. No shaking, no warning, nothing. They called it an orphan tsunami, a wave with no parent. For 290-odd years it sat in the archives as a curiosity, and then, once the ghost forests and the buried soils and the turbidites had established that something enormous had happened on the far side of the Pacific in the winter of 1699 to 1700, somebody made the connection and did the arithmetic. Tsunami waves cross the Pacific at a predictable speed, roughly the speed of a jetliner, about 10 hours from the Oregon coast to Japan. Work backwards from the recorded arrival times, and you get a departure time. 9 in the evening, Pacific time, on the 26th of January 1700. 4 independent lines of evidence, from tree rings, coastal stratigraphy, deep-sea sediment, and a Japanese village clerk who wrote down a date. All of them agree. And there is a 5th line, which was there the entire time and which science was slow to take seriously. The indigenous nations of the Pacific Northwest have oral histories describing exactly this. A night of violent shaking, the sea coming in, whole villages gone. Those accounts were recorded by ethnographers in the 19th and early 20th centuries and were, for a long time, treated as legend rather than testimony. They matched the physical record. They always did. There is a detail in those oral accounts that I find harder to shake than any of the physical evidence. Several of them describe not just the shaking and the water, but the interval between them. People who felt the ground move and then had time to react before the sea arrived. In some tellings, the ones who went uphill immediately survived, and the ones who went back for something did not. That is not a moral. It is a description of the actual physics of a near-field tsunami recorded by people standing in it, and it is the same instruction that emergency management gives today, 3 centuries later, in almost the same words. If the ground shakes for a long time on the Pacific Northwest coast, do not wait for a warning. There will not be one in time. Go up. So the earthquake is dated to the day. The magnitude is estimated between 8.7 and 9.2, based on how much the coast subsided, how far the rupture extended, and how big the wave was when it reached Japan. And the geological record shows at least 19 great earthquakes, magnitude 8 or larger, rupturing most of the Cascadia coastline over the last 10,000 years, which means we do not have to guess how this fault behaves. We have its diary, we have the entries, and once you have the entries, you can start counting the gaps between them, which is where this story stops being history and starts being arithmetic. Part 8. 41 Intervals. Here is the thing about earthquake averages that almost everybody gets wrong, including, for a long time, me. An average recurrence interval is not a schedule, it is not a countdown, it is not a due date, it is the arithmetic mean of a set of numbers that are wildly, almost uselessly variable, and when you present it without the spread, it does the opposite of informing people. It tells them the fault has a rhythm and it does not, so let us do it properly with the spread. Take the paleoseismic record, count every Cascadia earthquake that has been identified in the last 10,000 years, including both the full-length ruptures that broke the entire margin and the partial ruptures that only broke a section of it. That gives you about 42 events. 42 events means 41 intervals between them. Now line those 41 intervals up and ask a single question. How many of them were longer than the 326 years we have currently been waiting? 8. 8 out of 41. Which means the gap we are living in right now is longer than roughly 80% of the intervals in the entire 10,000-year record. But that is not the number that gets me, and here is why. The record is not uniform through time. The intervals were longer in the distant past, and they have generally gotten shorter in recent millennia. Nobody is entirely certain why. It may reflect real changes in how the margin behaves as sediment loading and plate geometry evolve. It may partly reflect the record itself being cleaner and more complete the closer you get to the present, which is a real and honest concern with any paleoseismic dataset. Either way, the more recent record is the more relevant record. So narrow the window. Over the last 6,000 years, the current 326-year gap is longer than about 90% of recorded intervals. Over the last 4,000 years, it is longer than approximately 95%. 95%. 19 out of 20. In 4,000 years of this fault's documented behavior, the wait we are in right now is longer than 19 out of every 20 waits that came before it. Now let me give you the averages, with all the caveats attached. For full margin ruptures, the ones that break the whole thing and produce a magnitude 9, the recurrence interval used in the National Seismic Hazard Model is about 500 years. That is the number most people have heard, but full margin ruptures are not the whole story. And this is the piece that gets lost every single time this subject comes up in the news. The southern portion of Cascadia, the stretch running from Cape Mendocino in northern California north through the Oregon coast, does something the northern portion does not. It breaks on its own. It produces its own earthquakes, in the magnitude 8 range, in between the full margin events. In the turbidite record, researchers have identified something like 18 to 20 smaller southern margin ruptures over the last 10,000 years, plus another 3 or 4 that broke the southern half to 2/3 of the margin, on top of the roughly 19 or 20 full-length events, which means that if you live in Coos Bay or Brookings or Crescent City, the 500-year number is not your number. Your number is worse. The Geological Survey put a figure on it last year. Combining full margin and partial margin ruptures, the overall recurrence for magnitude 8 to 9 events in southern Cascadia is roughly 300 to 350 years, and the fact sheet's working figure is 330. 330 years against 326 elapsed. Widen the definition further, down to magnitude 7.5 and above, and the average interval across the full and partial rupture record drops to about 233 years. On that accounting, we passed the mean in the early 1930s, There are geometry numbers underneath all this too, and they are worth having because they tell you what a southern rupture physically is. The segment running roughly 490 kilometers from Cape Mendocino, California, to Waldport, Oregon, has a designation in the literature. So does the shorter one, roughly 320 kilometers from Cape Mendocino to Cape Blanco. Combined, ruptures of those two segments recur on the order of every 530 years. A rupture of that length would be a magnitude 8 to 8.4, not a magnitude 9, which sounds like relief until you do the energy arithmetic. A magnitude 8.2 releases about the same amount of seismic energy as 178 magnitude 7 earthquakes. Not 178 times the shaking at any one place, but the same total energy budget. And the southern margin has not produced anything remotely on that scale in the entire instrumental record, which is the arithmetic behind the phrase strain accumulation. The energy is not gone, it has not been released in pieces. Cascadia does not do pieces. It is stored in rock, waiting on the only mechanism it has. There is an independent check on all of this from onshore, and I like it because it does not rely on sediment cores at all. Bradley Lake, on the southern Oregon coast, sits close enough to the sea that a large enough tsunami can overtop the barrier between them and dump a slug of marine sand and seawater into an otherwise ordinary freshwater lake. Core the lake bed, and you get a layer for every time that happened. 12 of them in the last 4,600 years, 12 tsunamis, one lake, independent of the turbidites, independent of the ghost forests, and telling the same story. I want to show you one more thing from that record, because it is the single best illustration of why partial ruptures matter, and why looking at full margin events alone will mislead you. If you plot only the full margin earthquakes, the magnitude 9s, on a timeline across 10,000 years, you find gaps. One of them is enormous, roughly 1,190 years between one full margin rupture and the next. Look at that bar on a chart and your immediate reaction is relief. 11 centuries. The fault clearly can go a very long time, except that during that 1,190-year gap, scientists have identified 5 partial ruptures, 5 separate large earthquakes on sections of the margin, none of which show up on a full margin chart because a full margin chart is not measuring them, and the same situation applies to the other apparent gaps. So the reassuring picture, the one where Cascadia sleeps for a millennium at a time, is an artifact of what you chose to count. Include the partials and the timeline fills in, and the fault stops looking like something that goes off twice a millennium and starts looking like something that goes off every couple of centuries, somewhere along its length, with the southern end doing most of the work, none of which tells you when. I keep saying that, and I am going to keep saying it, because the moment any of these numbers starts feeling like a prediction, we have gone off the rails. Individual intervals in this record range from under 100 years to more than 500. The variability is not noise around a true value. The variability is the phenomenon. A fault that averages 330 years can go 140, and then 510, and both of those are normal for it. The point of the arithmetic is not to build a countdown. It is to establish where in the distribution we currently are, and where we currently are is out in the tail. One caution about the turbidite record before we move on, because I would rather give you the weakness in the evidence than have you find it somewhere else and wonder why I skipped it. Turbidites are submarine landslides, and submarine landslides can be triggered by things other than earthquakes. Storms, sediment loading, slope failure that has simply been building up until it goes on its own. So the interpretation that a given turbidite layer represents an earthquake depends on the argument that the same layer appears simultaneously in canyons far enough apart that no local process could have set them all off. That argument has been made carefully, tested against radiocarbon dating, and defended in the literature for 2 decades, and it is also the part of the framework that critics push on hardest. The dating carries uncertainty too. Radiocarbon ages on deep-sea sediment come with error bars of decades to a couple of centuries, depending on the sample and the depth, which means the intervals I have been quoting to you are not known to the year. They are known to within a range, and when researchers redate the events with better methods, the intervals shift. That is exactly what happened when the chronology was revised, and it is the reason a number that used to be 100% became 95%. So treat the interval statistics as robust in shape and approximate in detail. The shape is what matters, and the shape says the current wait is unusually long by the standards of the last 4,000 years, by any version of the chronology anyone has published. Part 9. The numbers that get argued about. So, what is the probability? That is what everyone actually wants, and I want to give it to you carefully, because the published numbers vary by more than a factor of 3, and that variation is not sloppiness. It is the honest consequence of different questions. Start with the most conservative. If you assume earthquakes have no memory, which is a deliberately simple model that treats every day as equally likely, the chance of a magnitude 9 on the full Cascadia margin in the next 50 years is about 10%. Now assume the fault does have memory, that strain accumulates and the probability rises as the wait gets longer. Apply a time-dependent model that accounts for the 1700 date and that 10% becomes 15%. Then ask about the southern margin specifically, counting both full and partial ruptures, and the same time-dependent approach gives approximately 30% for a magnitude 8 or greater in the next 50 years, 30%, roughly 1 in 3 in the next half-century for the coastline running from Cape Mendocino up through southern Oregon. Older work put it higher. Goldfinger and colleagues, in the 2012 turbidite study, wrote the following. Time-dependent probabilities are similar for northern margin events at 7 to 12% and 37 to 42% in 50 years for the southern margin. That 37% figure is the origin of the number you may have seen quoted for years as the chance of the big one. It is a southern margin number, not a whole margin number, and it has been repeated so often without that qualifier that a lot of people believe the entire Pacific Northwest is at 37%. It is not. The North is at 7 to 12% for a full margin event. The South carries the higher risk, because the South breaks more often. And then there is the sentence in that same study that follows the probability figures, which almost nobody quotes, and which is the one I keep coming back to. Failure analysis suggests that by the year 2060, Cascadia will have exceeded 27% of Holocene recurrence intervals for the northern margin and 85% of recurrence intervals for the southern margin. 85% by 2060, 34 years from now, and we are already at 95% for the last 4,000 years. Chris Goldfinger said something in a university news release back in May of 2010 that has stayed with me, because it strips out the statistics entirely. Perhaps more striking than the probability numbers, he said, is that we can now say that we have already gone longer without an earthquake than 75% of the known times between earthquakes in the last 10,000 years. He said that 16 years ago. The wait has gotten 16 years longer since. There is one more line of research worth knowing about, and it is genuinely strange. In 2013, a group led by Ram Kulkarni tested whether Cascadia's earthquakes come in clusters, groups of events relatively close together separated by long, quiet stretches, rather than being evenly spaced. Their finding, verbatim. Results indicate that 13 catalogues exhibit statistically significant clustering behaviour, yielding a probability of clustering of 13 out of 20, or 0.65, and then the line that follows. Analysis of the 13 catalogues that manifest clustering indicates that the probability that at least one more event will occur in the current cluster is 0.82, 0.82, an 82% probability that the current cluster is not finished. And then, last year, Goldfinger and his colleagues published something in the journal Geosphere that changes the frame again. The title is unusually poetic for a geology paper. Unraveling the Dance of Earthquakes, Evidence of Partial Synchronization of the Northern San Andreas Fault and Cascadia Megathrust. Partial synchronization. Two of the largest fault systems in North America, adjacent to each other at the Mendocino Triple Junction, showing statistical coordination in the timing of their ruptures across the geological record. I want to be extremely precise about what that does and does not claim, because it is going to get exaggerated. Partial synchronization means the timing of ruptures on the two systems is not independent over centuries and millennia. It does not mean one detonates the other within minutes. It does not mean they always go together. It means the record shows a relationship that random chance does not comfortably explain, which is a very different sentence from the one people want, and considerably more unsettling than the one they are afraid of. Before we leave the probability numbers, I want to put them in company, because a percentage in isolation means almost nothing to a human brain, and a percentage next to its neighbours means quite a lot. In the same assessment that gives Cascadia a 15% chance of a magnitude 9 in 50 years, the deep earthquakes underneath Puget Sound, the kind that produced the Nisqually event in 2001, come in at 85% over the same window. Shallow crustal faults across the Puget Sound region, taken together, come in at 17% for a magnitude 6.5 or larger. The Seattle fault on its own is about 5%. The northern Willamette Valley around Portland is about 6%. So the megathrust is not the most likely earthquake to affect the Pacific Northwest in the next 50 years. It is nowhere close. An 85% chance of a damaging deep earthquake under Puget Sound is a near certainty by comparison. What the megathrust has is not probability, it is consequence. And there is one more reason those published probabilities differ so much from each other, which a group led by Seth Stein laid out in a paper with the best title in the field, is the Coast Toast. Their point was that the answer depends enormously on which statistical model you use, what you assume about the shape of the recurrence distribution, and how much you trust the dating of events several thousand years old. Reasonable researchers, using the same underlying data, land on numbers that differ by a factor of 3 or 4. That is not a scandal. It is what honest uncertainty looks like when it is written down instead of smoothed over. Part 10. Meanwhile, onshore, faults that never break are breaking. Everything up to this point has been about the ocean side of the plate boundary. The Gorda plate going down, the megathrust locked and silent, the deep interface humming in the north and not in the south. But a subduction zone does not stop at the coastline. The continent it is being shoved into has to absorb that motion too, and it does that on a network of faults running inland through Northern California, and those faults have had a genuinely unusual 6 weeks. Start with what happened 2 days before the offshore earthquakes. On Tuesday the 4th of August, a magnitude 4.0 struck about 19 miles northwest of Covilo, in the mountains of Mendocino County. On Wednesday the 5th, at 20 past 3 in the afternoon, a magnitude 4.1 hit the same area, and 59 seconds later, a magnitude 4.5. 59 seconds, and the larger of the two was the second one, and it was shallower, at about 2.8 miles depth, which is why a magnitude 4.5 was felt from Colusa all the way to Arcata, roughly 200 miles apart. There was no damage, nobody was hurt, but look at the shape of that sequence. 4.0, then 4.1, then 4.5, escalating over about 22 hours. That is backwards. Earthquake sequences are supposed to decay. There is a well-established law describing how aftershock rates fall off after a main shock, and the whole framework assumes the biggest event comes first, and everything after it is smaller and less frequent. What happened near Covelo was a swarm with no main shock, in which the magnitudes went up instead of down. That was on the Bartlett Springs fault zone, and a month earlier, on the 10th of July, there had been a magnitude 4.1 about 18 miles southeast along the same trace. 2 clusters of magnitude 4 events on one fault in under a month. That felt area is worth pausing on because it tells you something about the events that the magnitude alone does not. A magnitude 4.5 is a small earthquake. Felt reports coming in from 200 miles away for a magnitude 4.5 are not typical. The reason is depth. That event broke less than 3 miles below the surface, which is shallow enough that very little of the energy was absorbed on the way up. The shallower the source, the further the shaking travels for a given magnitude, and the more people notice something that the seismologists would otherwise file under routine. The epicentres sit in the mountains east of Island Mountain, out near where the Humboldt, Trinity and Mendocino County lines converge, which is about as empty as populated California gets. Light shaking as far north as Fortuna, Eureka and McKinleyville. Nothing broken, no damage reports, just a very large number of people in a very large area feeling a small earthquake at the same moment, and a lot of them going online to ask each other whether that was what they thought it was. Now go about 40 miles west and you find the Macama Fault, and the Macama has been having a year. On the 24th of June, a magnitude 5.6 struck near Ukiah. That was the largest earthquake ever instrumentally recorded on the Macama Fault. It cracked structures, caved in roofs, and knocked out power to about 10,000 customers. There were injuries, there were no deaths. Then, on the 28th of July, a magnitude 4.3 near Cloverdale, part of a sequence running to more than 160 events. And in between the two faults, in the corridor of country that separates the Bartlett Springs trace from the Macama trace, there has been swarm activity that belongs to neither, a magnitude 3.6, a magnitude 2.5, clusters of smaller events in a structural zone where the mapped faults are sparse, and the quaternary fault database does not have much to say. There is a cluster on the southern end of the Macama that included a magnitude 4.2, and it has the same signature as the Covello sequence, not a main shock with aftershocks decaying away underneath it. A collection of events of various sizes with no obvious largest event and no obvious decay. I want to flag one complication before anybody writes to me about it, because it is a real one. Sitting right in the middle of this region is the Clear Lake volcanic field, and on top of that volcanic field are somewhere between 15 and 20 geothermal power plants, which together form one of the largest geothermal complexes on the planet. Geothermal production involves injecting and extracting fluid from hot rock, and that reliably produces small earthquakes, thousands of them a year. So any honest accounting of Northern California seismicity has to separate the induced events around the geothermal field from the tectonic events on the Coast Range faults, and if you just look at a map with all the dots on it, you will badly overcount. The Covello events are not geothermal, the Ukiah event is not geothermal. Those are on mapped strike-slip faults, tens of miles from the production field, at depths and locations that have nothing to do with fluid injection. So what is actually going on out there? The honest answer starts with a number that sounds so small it seems irrelevant. These faults move at a rate of a few millimeters a year. The Bartlett Springs slip rate is genuinely unresolved, with published estimates spanning something like 1 to 9 millimeters a year depending on the method, which is an enormous range and tells you how thin the data is. The Macama runs faster, something in the range of 5 to 9 millimeters a year, and part of that is taken up by slow creep rather than earthquakes. A few millimeters a year is the width of a pencil lead, but run it for 1,000 years and it is meters. Run it for 2,000 years and you have enough stored slip to make a large earthquake, if the fault has been holding onto it rather than creeping it away. And that is the question that hangs over all of this, and nobody can currently answer it. The Bartlett Springs fault has never produced a large earthquake in recorded history. Not once since people started writing things down in California. That sounds like good news, and it is precisely the opposite. A fault that has not broken in the historical record is a fault about which you know nothing except that it is loading. The only window into its past is trenching, cutting across the fault trace and reading the offsets in the soil layers, and the trenching work that has been done there found evidence of at least 3 prehistoric earthquakes, the most recent somewhere between 300 and 1,000 years ago. 300 to 1,000 years ago. That is the resolution. That is the best anybody can do, and it is what an unresolved fault looks like. The Macama had the same status until this June. It was known to creep, known to be long, known to be capable in principle, and in 75 years of instrumental monitoring it had never produced anything larger than a moderate event. Then it produced the largest earthquake ever recorded on it, and cracked buildings in Ukiah, and everybody discovered at the same time that a creeping fault can still hurt you. So when I say these faults are waking up, I want to be careful about what I mean, because the phrase does a lot of unearned work. I do not mean that something has changed inside the rock. I do not mean a switch has been thrown. What I mean is narrower and more defensible. The rate of magnitude 4 and larger events on the Northern California Coast Range faults over the last 6 weeks is meaningfully above the background rate for those structures, and it is happening on more than one fault at once, and the sequences have a shape that does not fit ordinary main shock and aftershock behavior. That is an observation. Whether it is the beginning of something or a statistical clump is not knowable yet, and anyone who tells you otherwise is guessing with confidence. Part 11. What a millimetre a year buys you. Follow the Macama fault south from Ukiah, and it does not stop at the edge of the map. It runs down through Hopland and Cloverdale and Healdsburg, and around Santa Rosa it becomes, or connects to, or hands off to, depending on which paper you read and how strictly you define a fault boundary, the Rogers Creek Fault. And the Rogers Creek Fault runs south underneath the northern arm of San Francisco Bay, and connects, through a step under the water that was mapped relatively recently, to the Hayward Fault. The Hayward Fault runs directly underneath Berkeley, Oakland, Hayward and Fremont. It runs underneath a football stadium, several hospitals, major water mains, and about 2 million people's daily commute. Taken as a connected system, Rogers Creek and Hayward together are something on the order of 190 kilometers of fault, capable of a rupture in the magnitude 7.4 range if the whole thing went at once. Add the Macama to the north, and the total structure gets considerably longer. The Hayward Fault has produced large earthquakes on a fairly regular schedule, for as long as the geological record can see, roughly every 160 years or so, with meaningful uncertainty on that figure. The last one was in 1868. Do that arithmetic yourself. Now, I want to be very careful here, because this is exactly the kind of chain of reasoning that gets stretched into nonsense. A magnitude 4.5 near Covello does not load the Hayward Fault. It is roughly 150 miles away, and, as we established in some detail earlier in this video, static stress transfer does not reach anything like that far from an event that size. Nothing that happened in Mendocino County this month changed the hazard in Oakland by any measurable amount. What the connection actually gives you is a way to understand what these northern faults are. They are not isolated curiosities out in the Coast Range. They are the northern end of a plate boundary system that runs continuously from the Mendocino Triple Junction down into the Bay Area. The same relative motion between the Pacific Plate and North America that is being taken up on the San Andreas is also being taken up on the Macama, the Bartlett Springs, the Rogers Creek, the Hayward and the Calaveras. They divide the work between them, and the division is not fixed. Which brings me to the concept that I think is the most useful one in this entire video, and it is the reason I wanted to spend time on the onshore faults at all, rather than staying offshore where the story started. Think of the whole plate boundary as a ledger. Every year the Pacific Plate moves relative to North America by about 5 centimeters. Every year the Juan de Fuca and Gorda plates are shoved beneath the continent by 3 to 4 centimeters. Those are not estimates from theory. They are measured directly continuously by satellite geodesy, and they do not stop, and they do not slow down, and they do not care what any individual fault is doing. That motion has to be accounted for somewhere. Every centimeter goes into one of exactly 3 columns. It goes into slip during earthquakes. It goes into a seismic creep, faults sliding quietly without producing shaking, or it goes into elastic strain, stored in rock like a bent spring waiting. There is no 4th column. The motion does not evaporate. So when a fault creeps, it is paying its bill in installments. When a fault produces earthquakes, it is paying in lump sums, and when a fault does neither, it is not paying at all. It is borrowing. The Cascadia megathrust offshore is borrowing. It produces essentially no earthquakes, and its locked zone is not creeping, and it has been running that account since January of 1700. The Bartlett Springs fault onshore appears to be borrowing too, at least along part of its length, which is why the question of its creep rate matters so much, and why the unresolved slip rate is more than an academic annoyance. If it is loading at 7.5 millimeters a year, then in the 300 years since it last did anything, it has accumulated over 2 meters of unpaid slip, which is a large earthquake. If it is loading at 1.5 millimeters a year, it needs 2,000 years to get there, and it is nowhere near ready. Same fault, same geology, 2 completely different hazard assessments, and the difference between them is a number nobody has pinned down. The Hayward Fault is the cautionary tale at the far end of this system, and it is worth 2 minutes because it demonstrates what happens when a fault does both things at once. The Hayward creeps. You can see it. There are curbs in Hayward and Fremont that have been slowly offset over decades, sidewalks with a kink in them, a stadium in Berkeley that has been quietly pulled apart along a line running through the middle of it. That creep is real, and it is releasing strain continuously. And in 1868 it produced an earthquake of roughly magnitude 6.8 anyway, which at the time was called the Great San Francisco Earthquake, until 18 years later, a considerably larger one on the San Andreas took the title. The creep did not prevent the earthquake, it only handled part of the bill. That is the lesson the Macama delivered in June, in miniature. Creeping faults still break. A fault that is paying installments is still accumulating a balance, just more slowly, and the installments do not exempt it. And there is one more pattern from the global record that belongs here, because it is the thing that makes a single large earthquake a bad mental model for what these systems do. Earthquakes come in pairs more often than people realize. Seismologists call them doublets. 2 comparable events on adjacent segments of the same system, separated by anything from seconds to months. In 2006 and 2007, the Kural arc produced a magnitude 8.3 and then a magnitude 8.1 59 days apart. Sequences like that happen because the first rupture ends at a barrier and the stress it was carrying gets handed to the next segment along, and if that next segment was already loaded, it does not need much. So when people ask whether Cascadia and the northern San Andreas could go together, the answer is not that it is impossible. The paleoseismic work on partial synchronization suggests some kind of relationship exists over long timescales. The answer is that a cascade within minutes is speculation, a cascade within months has global precedent, and the geological record cannot resolve the difference between two events a week apart and two events in the same year, which is a very unsatisfying place to leave it. It is also where the evidence actually stops. Part 12. The two ledgers do not balance. So we have two independent accounts of the same convergence. Offshore, a plate is being driven down, and a megathrust is holding it, silently, storing 3 centuries of strain, giving off almost no signal, and responding to a magnitude 4.9 next door with precisely nothing. Onshore, a set of coast range faults is taking up the part of the motion that the subduction zone does not, and they have spent 6 weeks producing more magnitude 4 events than they normally produce in a year, including the largest earthquake ever recorded on one of them. And the honest, deflating conclusion is that these two ledgers do not talk to each other in any way we can currently detect. I want to say that clearly because it would be so easy and so satisfying to link them. The story writes itself. Cascadia loads the coast ranges start firing, the firing is the warning. It would make a great video. It would also be, on the evidence available, made up. The physical relationship between subduction zone strain and crustal fault activity in Northern California is real, but it operates on geological timescales, not on the timescale of a news cycle. The Mendocino Triple Junction has been migrating north for millions of years, and as it goes, it changes which faults are active and how fast. That is the connection. It is measured in millions of years, not in weeks. There is no established mechanism by which a locked megathrust that produces no earthquakes signals its state through the behavior of crustal faults 100 miles inland. If there were, we would have a Cascadia warning system, and we do not. So what do you actually do with two ledgers that do not balance and do not communicate? You read them both, separately, and you notice that both of them currently say the same uncomfortable thing, which is that a great deal of motion has gone into storage in this corner of the continent, and comparatively little of it has come back out. That is not a prediction. It is a description of an account balance, and the account balance is the only part of this entire story that is not in dispute. And I want to underline how that balance is actually known, because it is not inferred from earthquakes at all, which is what makes it so hard to argue with. Scattered across Oregon, Washington, Northern California, and British Columbia are permanent satellite positioning stations, bolted to bedrock, reporting their position continuously to within a few millimeters. They have been doing it for decades, and what they show is that the coastline is being squeezed inland relative to the stable interior of the continent at a steady rate of several millimeters a year, with the deformation largest near the coast and tapering off as you move east. That pattern is the fingerprint of a locked fault. If the megathrust was slipping freely, the coast would not be deforming, it would just be sliding. The fact that the coastline is being visibly bent right now this year, measured directly, is the observation that tells you the fault is stuck and the elastic energy is going in. You do not need paleoseismology to know Cascadia is loaded. You can see it in the satellites. The paleoseismology only tells you how the loan has historically been repaid. So the two ledgers do not balance against each other, but both of them are being audited continuously by instruments that have no interest in the outcome, and the audit says the same thing on both sides of the plate boundary. Part 13. The page that disappeared. I want to spend some time now on the part of this story that is not about rocks at all, because I think it is the part that actually determines whether people take any of this seriously, and because two specific accusations came up repeatedly this week, and both of them deserve a straight answer rather than a dismissal. The first one concerns a web page. There is a public education website about the Cascadia subduction zone that has been around for years, run by someone who is not a government agency and not a university, doing the unglamorous work of translating paleoseismology into language a person can actually read. For about 4 years it hosted a page built around the well-known 37% in 50 years figure, with a chart of 10,000 years of recurrence intervals, and it was, for a lot of people, the single clearest presentation of the Cascadia timing question available anywhere. And then it was gone. The address stopped working. Page not found. Now, if you had bookmarked that page, if you had used it, if you had cited it, and it vanished, and the vanishing happened right around the time the topic was getting more public attention, I completely understand the conclusion people reached. Somebody got to them. The numbers were too alarming. It got taken down. Here is what actually happened, and I went and checked, rather than speculating. The content did not disappear. It was reorganized into a longer, more detailed page, which as of the middle of July of this year is live, public, and considerably more thorough than what it replaced. And here is the part that demolishes the suppression theory entirely. The replacement is not softer, it is worse. The new page states plainly that the current 326-year gap is longer than roughly 80% of the intervals in the 10,000-year record, about 90% of the intervals in the last 6,000 years, and approximately 95% of the intervals in the last 4,000 years. It reproduces the Goldfinger 37 to 42% southern margin figure word for word. It reproduces the failure analysis line about exceeding 85% of southern margin recurrence intervals by 2060. It quotes the 75% statement from 2010. And then it does something I have never seen a public education site do. It hosts a downloadable spreadsheet provided by Chris Goldfinger and his team that lets any member of the public type in any start year and any end year they want and recompute the probability for themselves. That is not concealment. That is the opposite of concealment. That is handing the public the actual calculator. So what did change? One thing, and it is genuinely interesting. The older framing made an absolute claim that in the last 4,000 years, 0 intervals had exceeded the current gap, 100%. The updated page says approximately 95%. That is a real revision, and notice which direction it went. It went down. The updated number is less dramatic than the old one, not more. Why? Because the underlying dates moved. The turbidite chronology that all of these interval calculations rest on has been revised more than once. The 2012 work was updated in 2016, which shortened some of the northern segment averages, and the most current age estimates come from a paper published last year, using new dating methodology with revised dates in the supplemental material. When the dates of the earthquakes change, the gaps between them change, and every chart built on the old dates has to be rebuilt. That is what a scientific record correcting itself looks like from the outside. A page you had bookmarked stops working, and somebody has to redo the arithmetic, and while they are redoing it, the old version comes down. The suspicion was reasonable, the timing looked bad, the answer is boring. But I do not want to move on from this too quickly, because there is a lesson buried in it that I think is more important than the individual case. Institutions are astonishingly bad at deleting things gracefully. When a page comes down, there is almost never a note explaining why, almost never a redirect to the replacement, and almost never a version history a member of the public can check. The old address just breaks, and every single time that happens, on any topic, the vacuum gets filled by the most alarming available explanation, because that is the explanation that requires the least effort to construct and offers the most emotional payoff. The fix is not for the public to be more trusting. The fix is for the people publishing this material to treat the archive as part of the product. Leave the old page up with a banner pointing at the new one. Publish the reason for the change. Keep the previous version accessible. It costs almost nothing, and it removes an entire category of suspicion permanently. Until that happens, the correct response when a page disappears is the one that was taken here. Go and find out. Not assume malice, and not assume innocence either. Check. The answer took me under an hour, and it turned out to be more interesting than either of the theories. And I want to point out what survives the boring answer, because this is the part that matters. Even after the revision, even with the softened number, the Pacific Northwest has been quiet longer than 19 out of every 20 intervals in 4,000 years. The number that was supposedly too scary to leave online is still online. It just has a slightly different decimal in it. The second accusation is about the earthquake catalogue itself, and this one I have some sympathy with, because the observation behind it is completely correct. If you watch the raw seismograph traces from stations in rural Northern California, at Petrolia on the coast, and at Parkfield down on the San Andreas, you will regularly see clear, discrete arrivals that never appear in the published catalogue. Meanwhile, in Southern California, essentially every microquake gets located and published automatically, within minutes, without a human being touching it. That asymmetry is real. It is not imagined. And the explanation is instrument density, not intent. Southern California is one of the most densely instrumented regions on Earth. There are so many stations, so close together, that automated location and magnitude solutions meet quality thresholds without review, and the system can publish them straight away with confidence. Northern California, particularly the mountainous rural stretches from Mendocino north into Humboldt and Trinity counties, has a fraction of that coverage. Solutions there often fail the automated quality checks, which means they sit in a queue until an analyst reviews them, which introduces lag, and it means the smallest events never get located at all because too few stations recorded them clearly. There is a second, less satisfying part of the explanation. Not every spike on a seismogram is a local earthquake. Distant large earthquakes register on every station on the planet. Quarry blasts and mine shots produce sharp arrivals. Wind, traffic, logging equipment, cattle, and in one memorable case a woodpecker on the instrument housing all produce signals. The shape of the arrival distinguishes them, but you need someone or something to look. So yes. The catalogue in Northern California is less complete than the catalogue in Southern California, and the traces show more than the map does. That is a real and frustrating gap. It is a funding and physics problem. The fix is more instruments, not fewer secrets. And then there is a third claim, which I want to address because it comes up under every earthquake video ever made, and because this week happens to provide a perfect natural experiment. Solar activity does not appear to be driving this. I say that with some confidence because the sun right now is about as quiet as it ever gets. We are in solar minimum. The flare background this week has been down in the B class, which is the lowest category that gets measured, with readings as low as B2.7. The chance of a C-class flare has been sitting around 45 to 55%. The chance of an M-class is somewhere near 10% or lower, and the chance of an X-class is 1% or less. Solar wind speed has been running around 288 kilometers per second, which is slow. The sunspot groups that are visible are small and decaying, and imagery of the far side of the sun shows nothing large coming around. The sun is doing nothing. Northern California is having its busiest 6 weeks on the Coast Range faults in years, and the seafloor cracked twice in 8 seconds off Oregon. If solar activity drove earthquakes, this week should have been the quietest week of the decade, and the counterexample runs the other way too. The magnitude 9.1 earthquake off Japan in 2011, one of the largest ever recorded, occurred during a solar minimum as well. There is no established physical mechanism by which the energy in a solar flare couples to the stress state of a fault 20 kilometers underground. The numbers are not close. It is not a small effect that needs better measurement. It is an effect with no route from cause to consequence. Part 14. 5 minutes. I have spent most of this video telling you what things do not mean. The earthquake does not load the fault. The tremor is not a clock. The small quakes are probably coincidence. The missing web page was not suppressed. The sun is not doing it. So let me finish by telling you what does mean something, because underneath all of the debunking there is one set of numbers that is not ambiguous, not contested, and not going to be improved by better instruments. The state of Oregon commissioned a study of what a Cascadia earthquake and tsunami would actually do to its coastline. Not a scenario in the abstract, a modelled outcome with numbers. The modelling assumes the earthquake happens at 2 in the morning, because that is when people are most vulnerable. They're at home, or in hotels, or in vacation rentals, or in campgrounds. Lodging is assumed to be fully occupied, which on the Oregon coast in summer is realistic, and the analysis does not even include day trippers, who make up something like 5% of visitors, which means the real exposure is higher than what is modelled. Here is the result. If people begin evacuating 10 minutes after the shaking starts, the combined resident and visitor death toll ranges from about 15,550 in the smaller modelled scenarios to about 45,700 in the largest. And if the average departure time is 15 minutes instead of 10, in that largest scenario, the estimate rises to about 74,164 people. Read those two numbers again. 45,700 at 10 minutes, 74,000 at 15 minutes. That is 30,000 lives. On 5 minutes. Not 5 minutes of evacuation time. 5 minutes of hesitation. The difference between a coastline where people move immediately and a coastline where people spend 5 minutes finding shoes, looking for the dog, checking on a neighbour, waiting for an official announcement that is not coming, or simply standing still trying to understand what just happened. There is one more figure in that analysis, and it is the one that reframes everything. Anyone caught in about 2 meters of tsunami flow, roughly 6.5 feet, has approximately a 1% chance of survival. At shallower depths the odds improve, perhaps toward 50%, but survival there does not mean walking away unhurt. A tsunami is not a flood. It is a fast-moving slurry full of cars, timber, glass, boats and pieces of buildings, arriving in a region where the roads have just been destroyed, the hospitals have just been damaged, and help is days away. Which is why the solution people keep proposing is not evacuation education, or better warning systems, or anything that depends on information arriving in time. On that coastline, in a near-field event, no information arrives in time. The shaking is the warning. The solution is vertical evacuation structures, buildings and platforms engineered to survive the shaking and stand above the wave, placed in the communities where natural high ground is simply too far to reach on foot in the minutes available. That is a construction problem with a known cost, and the arithmetic of 30,000 lives against the cost of concrete is not, when you actually look at it, a difficult calculation. There is a piece of technology that gets mentioned a lot in this conversation, and I want to set expectations about it honestly, because I think a lot of people believe it will save them, and it will not, at least not in the way they imagine. There is an earthquake early warning system operating along the west coast. It works by detecting the first, faster, less damaging seismic wave at stations near the epicentre and sending an alert ahead of the slower, more destructive wave. It is genuinely useful. It can give you seconds to a few tens of seconds, enough to stop a train, open a fire station door or get under a table. It cannot help you if you're standing on top of the rupture. And in a Cascadia event, the coastal communities are standing on top of the rupture. The warning and the shaking arrive together, which is why every piece of official guidance for that coastline says the same thing, and says it in the imperative. The shaking is the alert. If it goes on for more than a minute, do not wait for anything else. As soon as you can walk, go inland or go up. The other thing worth knowing is the timing. For a near-field Cascadia tsunami, the first wave reaches parts of the outer coast in roughly 15 to 20 minutes, and in some locations considerably less. That number is why every argument about evacuation is an argument about minutes. There is no scenario in which help arrives, or an announcement is made, or a decision is escalated to somebody in authority. Whatever is going to happen has already been decided by where people are standing and how fast they start moving. And that is genuinely the whole preparedness message stripped of everything else. Not stockpiles, although those matter afterward, not gadgets, just knowing, before it happens, which direction is up, and having already decided that you will go immediately without waiting to understand. If you live on that coastline, or you're going to be on it this summer, the single most useful thing you can do this week takes about 10 minutes. Find the tsunami evacuation map for the specific place you sleep. Look at where the line is. Work out your route on foot, not by car, because the roads will be broken and the bridges may be gone, and then do it once. Actually walk it. Time it. That is it. That is the entire intervention, and it is the difference between the 15,000 number and the 74,000 number. So here is where all of this lands, and I want to bring it back to a magnitude 4.9 in an empty stretch of ocean, because that is where we started. That earthquake changed nothing. It did not load the megathrust. It did not shorten anyone's timeline. The hazard along the Cascadia subduction zone this morning is exactly what it was on Tuesday. What it did was make a few of us look, and when I looked, I found a margin that has been storing strain since before the United States existed. A fault that produces almost no earthquakes of its own, so it cannot tell us how it is doing. A deep zone that hums a few times a decade in a language we can hear but cannot yet translate, and that stayed silent in the south this week while it sang in the north. A 326-year gap that is longer than 19 out of 20 gaps in 4,000 years. A 1 in 3 chance over the next 50 years for the southern coastline. An 82% statistical probability that the current cluster of Cascadia earthquakes is not finished. And a set of coast range faults inland that have spent 6 weeks doing things they have not done in 75 years. None of it is a warning. All of it is a description, and that is the part I cannot get comfortable with. Cascadia is the most thoroughly studied subduction zone on the planet. We have 10,000 years of its history read out of tree rings, mud, deep sea sediment, a Japanese village record, and the oral testimony of the people who were standing there when it happened. We know the date of the last one to the day. We have satellites measuring how much the coast is being squeezed, instruments listening to a fault that will not speak, and a map that draws the deep edge of the megathrust in points of light. And with all of that, the fault is mute. So the question I am left with is not whether Thursday's earthquake was a warning. It was not. The question is the one underneath it, and I do not have an answer, and as far as I can tell, neither does anybody else. If a fault this well understood can go 326 years without giving us a single unambiguous signal, then what does the signal look like when it finally comes? The tremor map updates continuously. The southern margin is due for an episode, and if one arrives in the next few weeks, the thing to watch is not whether it happens, but how big it is and how far it spreads, because a delayed and oversized episode in the south would mean something quite different from a normal one. I will be watching for it. I would recommend you do too. Because the honest answer to what the warning looks like might be that we will only recognize it in hindsight, staring at the same charts we're staring at right now, wondering how we missed it.